Thank you for staying with us. The war in Iran is already disrupting global supply chains, particularly through the Strait of Hormuz, a key route for oil, gas, and fertilizer shipments. For many African countries, this matters because of our high dependence on imported fuel, agricultural inputs, and food. Early signs are already being felt, even here in Nigeria. We have rising costs of transportation, pressure on fuel prices, and concerns about fertilizers in other parts, availability of this ahead of key planting seasons. Analysts warn that these disruptions could have a disproportionate impact on African economies, given existing vulnerabilities in trade, infrastructure, and fiscal capacity. Today on One Slot, we examine what this means in practical terms, how exposed African countries are, and what options government have to respond. My guest for the second half is Kelvin Chisanga, economist. He joins us from Lusaka. We also have Professor Z.N. Iraqi. XN, I beg your pardon. Professor XN Iraqi, he is of the Faculty of Business and Management Sciences, University of Nairobi. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here.
Thank you so much, my pleasure.
Professor XN, I apologize again. So I'll start with you. Please just help us understand what exactly is happening in the global supply chains right now.
Economists say that if you teach a parrot how to say supply and demand, it can claim to be an economist. So by restricting the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, you are reducing the supply of oil into the global market. And by extension, the price is going up. Now, when the price of oil goes up, it affects the price of very many other commodities and services, because oil or fuel is an input in the production of very many goods and services. So you earlier talked about transport. You talk about things like crops, because there are some of the products that come from exploration of oil is fertilizer, which we use for growing crops. And over the years, our food crops or our crops have become addicted to fertilizer. So the price of goods and services will go up, and the price of food will also go up, because there will be late harvest if we don't get fertilizer on time. So wherever you are likely to be affected by the events that are taking place in the Middle East because of the Iran war.
Kelvin, are we looking at a short-term shock or a prolonged crisis in this instance from the optics that we're looking, and how much of an impact will these issues around the Strait of Hormuz continue to have on African economies? Kelvin, please.
We understand pretty very well that, yes, we understand pretty very well that the Strait of Hormuz, it's an important trade corridor for most of the items that basically interplay from there, especially when you look at the oil commodity and other shipping materials. Even in the case of maybe African countries, some of them, they export minerals which also pass through that trade corridor. So it's something that basically has a huge cascading effect in the food supply chain, which will basically also speak into aspect of high spikes of inflation, which again also brings about an aspect of cost of capital, where interest rates and a few other productive elements to be able to have a pass-through transmission mechanism in terms of effect. So when you look at it, even from the concept of fertilizer, that also brings about high cost factors that will be able to interplay, which will basically now bring about food insecurity and many other related effects from there, which in a case also can link now to Africa's profile of destabilization, where there can be social disorder and many other aspects, such as protesting and all that. So it has an interlinking factor to the social fabric, social order, and even much more. It can now take a different twist, even on African countries, to take up issues of public expenditure, which can now land with the aspect of budget deficit and many other related issues from there. So by and large, what I should be able to say that it has a huge cascading effect which we'll be able to be seeing in our public resource at household level, regional level, even at as a continent as well. We can actually be able to see this to be a huge factor that will be able to drive, a difficult situation as it is, because that area has also a dairy production or consumption movement of about about 20 billion US dollars in monetary form, and it contributes to about 20% or 20 to 25% of oil supply in the global market. That region has got also about 30% of oil supply that's supposed to be interplaying into the regional market as well.
All right, Prof. Africa, still talking vulnerabilities, Africa imports a large share of its fuel, fertilizer, and even food. That dependency makes the continent especially exposed to global shocks when it does come. Countries like Kenya, Sudan, and Somalia rely heavily on fertilizer shipments from the Gulf, and that has now been disrupted. Why is Africa more vulnerable than other regions to this kind of disruption?
That's an interesting question, because in addition to what is happening in Iran, our supply chains and the sources of food and fertilizers were affected by the war in Ukraine. You remember a lot of wheat that we eat in Kenya, in Egypt, and other countries come from Ukraine. So I think the reason why Africa is very vulnerable to such disruption, particularly in the food sector, is we don't invest enough in the food sector. If you go to banks and you're looking for a loan and you want to start a factory, you probably will get a loan faster than somebody who wants to farm. We have not invested enough in irrigation. We just wait for the rains. And if you go to our universities, if you go to the public sector, we don't see farming as something cool. And very important, the government does not give farmers what other governments do or in other countries, enough subsidies. Because if you go to India and other countries, whether it is raining or not, farmers are always given subsidies to make sure that they keep producing and there's food security. So because we don't put enough attention or we don't focus enough on food, then we become very vulnerable. Anytime there's a crisis in areas or in countries that give us food, we import out of, for example, rice from Pakistan. We import wheat from other countries. So as long as we don't focus on food security, this problem will persist, even without a crisis in the Middle East.
Kevin, is there a real possibility of a food crisis for us here in Africa?
It seems like it's something that is brewing up, which will be able to happen anytime soon. Especially, we have a situation where there is a template already that we basically worked with when there was a war, which still happening with Ukraine and Russia. So already that set a precursor to see where we're going. And this tells to say that what we need to do going forward, we need to have a system where we can now start having surviving kits around issues of eventualities of this nature. So geopolitical risk is one thing that now is telling us, especially in the oil places where we get oil in terms of supply markets, we should be able to work out some means, because obviously what we are seeing also is that we will build up transport inflation, which will now have a huge telling effect on the local economies in Africa. And much more, we have seen that there are countries that are heavily importing from outside, even standing at 80% to 90%. And even when you look at the whole situation, maybe I can also just give you an idea of a Zambian situation. Whenever there is an increment in fuel prices, it speaks directly also into our local market. We have even embraced a model where we are doing monthly fuel calculation or monthly fuel reviews, which basically works out with an aspect of global oil trend in terms of pricing factors. And what we consider, maybe in the case, is that we consider the local market performance in currency and the global market as the key parameters. So it's the same case with what is happening in the region as well, where we're seeing that this now is coming as a serious shock, the identifying and amplifying aspect of food insecurity, which is yet to be taking place. And this tells actually a story to say, I think we need to set everything light in motion working out with the, some levels of planning so that we can see how best we can move ourselves from this economic quagmire. And much more also, even now looking at the African situation, I think it's important to look at, creating self-sufficient model, especially when it comes to agriculture. Because obviously what we are seeing now, when you look at the aspect to do with the, disruption that is taking place there, it tells a story to say our food processing and capacity in terms of, a production basket will not be able to meet up to the required capacity, meaning there will be deficit that will be seriously standing in the region. That also is something that is standing to be triggered with a cost factor, meaning what we'll be able to see at the end of it, we'll see the high cost of food, especially for those food that are basically consumed in Africa, like maize, rice, and few others, which are actually essential commodities at household level. So that is something that is seriously speaking to say we are going to face this food risk factor as a key challenge in our planning and the growth profile of economic activities across the region.
Professor Exan, interestingly, it's not all the impacts are negative, yeah? Oil-producing countries like Nigeria and Angola could see higher revenues from rising oil prices. But even that comes with complications. Why don't higher oil prices always translate into broader economic gains?
That's a very fascinating question, because countries that produce oil like Nigeria, Angola, should be celebrating all the way to the bank. I know Russia is celebrating because even sanctions were lifted because of the shortage of petrol or fuel from the Middle East. But I think the reason why Africa doesn't benefit from higher fuel prices is because sometimes we squander that windfall. We don't put it into development. We don't put it into good use. So I wish African countries would now take advantage of higher oil prices and maybe save that money or put it to development projects, and if possible, even put it into farming so that we become more food secure. I'm excited by this because Kenya has some oil, but we have not been exploiting it. So I'm hoping that because of higher oil prices, it will become now economically feasible to exploit that oil. But I'm hoping that any increase in oil prices will help African countries in development and becoming food secure.
Okay, Kelvin, some African countries are already responding, building fuel reserves, introducing subsidies and trying to stabilize markets. But the question is, will that be enough? What immediate steps should governments take to cushion the shocks that we expect to keep coming? It's 3 weeks in, but I mean, it's been felt hard.
The best way is to also look at creating policy levers for subsidies on most of the countries. But again, we have to be very much conscious because most of the countries across the globe, across the market in Africa, we've actually been seeing that they have been facing serious debt issues, where we are also seeing them trying to restructure some of the debts. Like in the case of Kenya, we've seen that Kenya has been working hand in hand with the IMF. Similar the case with the Ghana. We have also seen Zambia also doing the best job as well regarding this. So it will be a temporal measure that can actually be able to work in the short term to cushion the impact or salvo effect that can actually come as a result of fuel price growth from that point. Then the other part that we should be able to look at is alternative sources of supply. I think it's high time we look at alternative sources. Also working with people like Dangote, trying to see how best we can work with a new refinery that was set up in Nigeria. I understand Nigeria has been cushioned because there is a security of supply, which has been emphasized by David Bett, who is actually the MD of Dangote refinery, which also can be the same to look at Africa. Africa's a very appetizing demand even for what we can do together, especially at the point when we are trying to gravitate and coordinate the efforts of each and every country from that perspective. The issue of trying to work with now neighboring countries like Zambia is a very important location with Tanzania, where we get fuel through that pipeline. And again, we've got also Namibia, where we can also see that they are under exploration of some sort, and they have actually advanced to a level where they are now able to get crude oil from there. Similarly, it's also happening with Angola. So they can be now interdependent. Government-to-government relationship can be established to ease some of these aspects so that we can actually be able to, work out something better and put things in perfect order. Then the other aspect is to look at how best can we lock in maybe some contract which can actually be forward contract with some of these markets which are emerging. Like, for example, look at Russia. I think it's high time we looked at Russia to be a key supply of African demands in terms of oil. And again, what we need to look at is to also get more storage facilities, as you mentioned. In the Zambian case, we only have storage to store up to 60 days. So we need to buffer that as well to ensure that we go even something like three months in terms of storage capacity, just like the way we should be able to look at it as well from other countries as well.
Yeah, you talk about storage capacity. Prof, doesn't this crisis perhaps re-highlight the need, rather urgent, for Africa to build a better supply chain resilience, and then talking about the storage capacity, infrastructure, and all that?
I believe this crisis is the best incentive for actualizing the African free trade area. Because you see, if you look at the African continent, Angola, Brisbane, Sao Tome, Equatorial Guinea, the other countries that are producing oil, they're not affected by this crisis. But there's very little trade among African countries. The communication, the logistics are not very good. So I think what we need to do is to exploit this crisis, as Winston Churchill said, there's nothing like a bad crisis, so that we now make African free trade area a reality. So that now we can now not only just trade among ourselves and exchange food, because some parts of Africa have surplus food, others have shortage. Some parts of Africa have surplus of oil, others have less oil. So the time we actualize that and we trade among ourselves. I also think that it's a high time we run from COVID-19. Maybe we need to start working from home so that we reduce the demand for oil, and that will put less pressure on the prices of oil. There's nothing wrong with running from the past.
Okay. Kevin, I don't know if you have a thought on that, or you just want me to ask you something different.
Okay, yes, I think just in line with what Professor is saying, but my additional component is that I think it's high time also we have a diversity of some kind, where we also need to explore, biofuel in local markets. We've got potential aspect in each and every individual countries around. Zambia in particular is trying to undergo a project of biofuel, trying to see if we can make up ethanol and many other, petrochemical substances of some sort using biosystem. And again, it's important also that countries across Africa should now work on a template of policy instrumentation, of making sure the green technology that we're developing in electric cars should come in with some levels of flexibility, so that we should be able to have a combination of fuel machine movement as well as also electric vehicles, so that maybe that can also be a benchmark and a baseline to actually help out with the current situation, or even situation that may tend to come as external shocks from that basis.
All right, Prof, your final thoughts on the subject.
I think this is a crisis that I don't think is the last one. It's not the first one. So for any crisis that we get like this, let's learn lessons. Let's adjust our economic systems. Let's become innovative. Because at the end of the day, you notice that when there's such a crisis, every country has its own crisis. So you cannot wait for another country to help you. You're on your own. But Africa is a big continent. We have a lot of resources. What we need to do is to work together for the benefit of the African continent. And we can weather any crisis.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for obliging us on One Slot today.